Well, how can artificial intelligence tools help workers with dementia? To talk about that, I'm joined by James Fletcher. He's assistant professor in the Department of Management at the University of Bath. James, thank you so much for doing this.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's a really interesting subject. So let's start with your interest in this. How did you end up covering this field? Tell us about your career.
Yeah, so I think like a lot of people who research dementia, I have a lot of personal experience of dementia. So I've pretty much always had a close relative with dementia, and that is how many of us end up in the field. I do a lot of research on the problems that people with dementia face in complex systems. So that might be in the research economy or in public transport systems, how their cognitive impairments work within those systems. And actually, the things that you might suspect people with dementia would tell you would be problems that they were experiencing. You might expect that they would be issues around cognitive impairment itself. Um, they're often not the things that people actually tell me about. The things that people often say are the worst aspects of having dementia are the sort of institutional things that are built on top of it. So a classic example of that is being stripped of their driving license when they are diagnosed and losing that independence. And another example is losing their jobs. So I think we often think because dementia is associated with older people and with later life, we often assume that people are sort of already retired when they're diagnosed with dementia. But that's not the case for a lot of people, and we know that for people who are diagnosed whilst they're working, they have double the chance of being unemployed within a year of their age-matched.
Well, let's take it a bit at a
Years.
time because
Yeah,
you're right. When you say dementia, my mind goes to somebody much older. People
yeah.
tend not to be diagnosed, my understanding, that early. How many people in the workforce do you think have already been diagnosed with dementia? I mean, just percentage wise, do we have an idea of this at all?
So we don't know figures on the number of people working while diagnosed. There are a couple of things that are coming together to make dementia a workforce issue. So diagnosis is expanding generally, and that means that we have a larger number of what we would call young onset diagnoses. So that's people who are diagnosed before the age of 65, and obviously we would probably expect those people to be working. We'd consider them to be of working age. The other factor driving dementia as a workforce issue is that people are increasingly working longer. Our working lives are extending. So I think at the moment you have somewhere in the region of 10% of Americans aged 75 plus who are remaining in formal employment. So as we spend longer and longer in the workforce, it follows that we're more likely to end up with dementia in the workforce.
Okay, I want to come back and talk about the employer's role in this, but let's talk about the individual first. If you are somebody who's in the workforce and wants to stay there for however long, but you have been diagnosed, or maybe even suspect that you have some kind of impairment, there are new tools, correct? AI
Yeah,
can help us here. Give us an idea
yeah.
what you could use.
So there are various tools that work to basically do a bit of the cognitive work that we do in the workplace anyway, on our behalves. I mean, these are thinking machines. They can think with us. And none of that's new because that's the way humans work. We outsource a lot of how we think to different technologies. AI in particular offers some really interesting tools for workers with dementia because of some of the difficulties that they face. So a really great example of this is the symptom of aphasia. So this is where you struggle to basically articulate the next word in a sentence and your pattern of speech might fall apart slightly. So obviously with large language models, we have created tools that are essentially ideally suited to that impairment. They are perfect next word prediction machines. If we can then think about integrating those LLM capabilities into things like email software, so that if people are struggling to pick up the next word in a sentence, the system can just give them a bit of a hint, a bit of help, then that's really powerful. And of course, we can go further than that because we can distill models, run them locally, we can personalize them on people's particular communication histories. So if you think in the course of your working life, you probably send an awful lot of emails, right? So there's a really reliable training database for me to teach an LLM not just what word might come next in this email, but what word might come next in Linda's email specifically. And that could be a really useful tool for people if we were to implement that. There are other examples. So, for example, comprehension can become more difficult for people with dementia. And so, what we do in our line of research is we change our documentation into accessible formats. So, there are font changes, there are changes to how we structure sentences to make them more accessible to people with cognitive impairments. Well, the transformer architectures of LLMs do exactly that. They transform one type of content into another type of content. And so you can prompt a consumer grade LLM to transform documents into a dementia friendly format, and it will do that instantly. And if that was implemented into people's, emails or calendars, then all of the memos and the content that they were having to read could be automatically transformed into dementia-friendly formats.
And I guess at one point you might have had an assistant if you were getting to a point where you couldn't handle anything, and this is the machine replacement for the person who might have done things for you.
Yeah, definitely. So that's something that is probably a bit more out there at the moment, and I'm not aware of it being done. But certainly, as these tools become more agentic, that is something that could be developed. Of course, you stray into questions when you talk about these things, and I'm sure you cover this a lot in the podcast in terms of, at what point are we moving from supporting humans to remain in that role and to do that role better versus we've reached a point where actually this person is so impaired and the tools are so proficient that it maybe makes sense to be like automating those tasks generally.
Well, I mean, the question comes up even when you don't have someone who's impaired, because you can
Yeah.
automate a lot of tasks. Um, we're talking about early dementia, right? I mean, we're not talking about advanced. There's nothing in AI that can really hold back somebody whose dementia is progressing quite rapidly.
No, I think yeah, it's important to state that we are talking about the earlier stages of the condition, though it's important to state that when people talk about early to mid to late dementias, I think they sometimes think that that's associated with a set time frame, and the reality is that it really isn't. So if you are diagnosed with a dementia today, you might be relatively unchanged in 6, 7 years' time, or you might be profoundly impaired in a year or two's time. So there's a real diversity of prognosis with dementia, and of course. One of the real problems with the current situation, whereby people are largely excluded from the workforce once they're diagnosed, is that that is really bad for your cognitive outcomes. When you're suddenly
Yeah.
isolated and a lot of your purpose in life is stripped away, that can be really terrible for somebody's cognitive outcomes. And so, actually, by supporting people to remain in the workplace longer, we're not necessarily just sort of keeping them as long as possible. We're also potentially helping them in a sort of pseudo-therapeutic manner by probably ironing out the sort of progression of that dementia somewhat, making sure that they have a purpose in life, they're cognitively engaged, performing tasks every day. That stuff is really useful for your cognition.
If you're enjoying this conversation and want to bring insights like these to your next event, visit lindanazareth.com to book Linda Nazareth as your keynote speaker. Linda is an economist and futurist, and she is a dynamic and experienced speaker who has presented to audiences across a broad range of industries on the megatrends shaping the economy and the future of work. That's lindanazareth.com, or send an email to speaking@lindanazareth.com.
I can't imagine any worker wants to be diagnosed and let their employer know that they have dementia. Is this going to be more common that large companies at least make you go through some kind of testing on a regular basis? I don't know how often it's done these days. And obviously, it's going to vary by country too. And there's going to be different laws around it. But still, I can't imagine anyone not dreading this.
Yeah, and I think at the moment, given the trajectories we've talked about, you are much more likely to end up without a job. Um, it's it entirely makes sense that people are quite anxious often about disclosing, and typically people will not disclose a diagnosis until a point of crisis really forces their hand, and they have to disclose that. Um, I would hope, and the way that I find it really interesting to reflect on this is that when I first moved into the university sector, we did not have the sort of vast array of different allowances that we can make today for our students who have mental health
That's true.
problems.
Mhm.
That is something that during my career has come on leaps and bounds. We now have a system whereby if one of my tutees comes to me and they're experiencing a particular crisis, we've got a list of strategies that we can go to. The organization can put them in place, and that will enable them to, continue their studies in the way best suited to them. And what goes hand in hand with that institutional change is the cultural change. So my students will now come and talk to me about their mental health problems in a way that they wouldn't have maybe even 10 years ago. Um, if dementia could move to a similar situation in another 10 years, that would be wonderful. If we both had the institutional strategies in place to deal with it, and there was a corresponding culture change whereby people felt able to disclose. Because I think we often don't appreciate this, but many people with dementia put an awful lot of work into concealing their dementia. That's an awfully large part of their life, and it'd be nice if that wasn't the case.
It wouldn't. It wouldn't. I mean, I don't like the idea of, say, a politician with dementia leading a country, or I don't think many shareholders would like to think the CEO had dementia. I mean, it's more than a cultural shift, right?
Yes, I mean, again, the reasons that we think that that is sort of problematic, is because of a lot of the ingrained ideas that we have about dementia, particularly as diagnosis shifts and people are diagnosed earlier, you end up in a situation where there's a large proportion of people with dementia whom, to all effects and purposes, you and I, in an immediate interaction, maybe wouldn't even know that that person has a dementia. We are not talking about the sort of stereotype of a very old person drooling in a nursing home, the sort of the ideas that people conjure when they think about dementia. We are talking about people who are, you or I, in our everyday interactions, they're not necessarily different. And maybe they just have a particular impairment in a specific domain. So perhaps that person has aphasia and struggles with language prediction, but maybe in terms of their problem solving abilities, they're better than you or I, right? This it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is just automatically incapable of thought and an incapacitated person.
I know it's maybe hard to answer, but are you aware of any corporate programs that do support this? I mean, you're in Britain, I'm not sure about other countries, but we have wellness programs and you try and help workers with maybe like failing eyesight with better screens. Is there any screening for dementia where companies, organizations actually come up with tools to help workers?
Not at the moment. And again, this speaks to a number of stereotypes about dementia not being a workforce issue, and also that people with dementia are sort of effectively incapable of work, which is not necessarily the case, which leads us to this situation where we have a growing likelihood of people developing dementia whilst in work, but also we know that realistically they're going to conceal it because their outcomes are pretty bad if they don't conceal it. Um, as I say, the hope is that that will change over time, if for no other reason than because extending working lives and supporting people with disabilities to remain in the workforce is basically a goal that is shared by governments and organisations and individuals. It is something that everybody wants. We just need to move further towards that place.
What would you advise somebody who, I don't know, maybe suspects they have dementia or a family member does, or has been tested and is told they're early in the process? Would you reveal it? Would you look for tools yourself? How could you get set up against this?
So I think preempting these things and dealing with these things early is really key. The normal trajectory of dementia is that several people have suspicions, but nobody really discusses it until a point of crisis that then pushes people into diagnosis and down this route. If we can have better conversations about it and start to deal with these things earlier, that's preferable because the point of diagnosis is a stressful time and is realistically the worst possible time for you to then also be attempting to put all these processes in place and to deal with things. So a lot of this is preemptive. So if organizations can have strategies in place that people can draw on when needed, that's useful. If people themselves can have been experimenting with different tools and trying to find out what works for them, that's really useful. And this is, you know, my particular interest is digital technology, but this is not something which is brand new. Maybe, yeah, 8, 10 years ago would be going to people with dementia's houses and they would have special physical calendars or diary systems. They would have worked out systems that allowed them to maintain their independence and to basically perform their normal tasks using back then very basic term, maybe a paper and pen, right? But it's still using external technologies to help you perform cognitive labor. And it just so happens that we increasingly live in a world where many more of those tools are available to us.
How comfortable would you be if an organization said, we're going to start testing for this at a certain age, as people test, as you have to have a test for your driver's license at a certain age and the like?
Yeah, I always think with all of these things, if that testing is a route to support, that's fantastic. If it's a route to sort of, thinning the flock and getting rid of the people who are
Yeah.
causing problems, that's less ideal. And again, I think that's not necessarily something that anybody would desire. All of the people with dementia who I work with who have been made redundant, they would have preferred to remain in the workforce. They have been let go at expense to their organisations, the expense of then having to replace them as well. We are talking often about older workers who have the bulk of the organization's experience, the bulk of the organization's networks, the things that junior colleagues tend to be sort of catching up on compared to their older colleagues. And at a state level, that is then one more person who is all of a sudden not contributing to the formal
Right.
economy, is potentially reliant on welfare. Everybody loses in that situation. So if we can use testing, and this is what diagnosis should be, diagnosis should be a route toward the optimal support for that person. That's basically the gateway through which we direct people at support. If it becomes a mode of effectively penalizing people in the workforce, that's when it becomes a problem. So it's not necessarily a question of whether we should or shouldn't. It's about the infrastructure we have in place around that, what we're going to use to then make that diagnosis useful for a person.
What about government, since you mentioned welfare and the like? Is there a role here to implement technology, to spend money in an area? What would you like to see being done?
I mean, I think the government could probably, and again, I'm a Brit, so I probably have a different experience of government and the development of welfare states and how we intervene in corporate and personal processes. I think our government, like many governments around the world, has an ambition that it is going to use technologies to enable people in the workplace, to increase productivity, and also to ease the sort of stereotyped burdens that are associated with later life, particularly around ill health and dementia. So the ambition is there. Um, there is, of course, the question of the resource that is put into that. So it's obviously fine for us to sit here and say, okay, ideally, everybody wins if organizations have this in place. If I run an organization, I might think to myself, well, that sounds quite costly, to develop those strategies and put these things in place. So I think it's no bad thing if the government plays a role in trying to incentivize that, and that may be through, you know, the classic levers of sort of friendly taxation regimes or direct incentives linked to individual employees. But if mechanisms can be pulled in order to incentivize this, then that is a really good thing. The other part, of course, is we are talking about something which is still not necessarily on everybody's radar. People are mostly not thinking of dementia as a workplace issue. So the government also has a very basic role to play in terms of saying, okay, we're talking to you about disability in the workforce, and we're talking to you about extending working lives. Well, let's put those two things together, and the point at which they meet is dementia in the workplace. So there's also a bit of sort of consciousness raising that this is an emerging issue, and that, as population aging progresses 10, 20, 30 years down the line, this is going to be a serious workplace issue.
For sure. And lots more to talk about there. So I'm glad we started the conversation. James, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
James Fletcher is an assistant professor at the University of Bath. Thanks for listening to Work in the Future. If today's episode sparked ideas for your organization, reach out. I would love to help you shape the future of work at your next event. To discuss your event and book me as a speaker or moderator, please visit lindanazareth.com or email speaking@lindanazareth.com. You can also visit me on Instagram at lindanazareth keynote speaker and send me a direct message there. If you did like this discussion about the future of work, please remember to subscribe to the podcast. Also, your reviews really help people to find us, so please make sure you take time to leave one wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening. And as always, thank you to Stokely Audio for audio production.